Here we are in the great outdoors, flies everywhere, as you can see. That is the Great Australian Salute. Look, it's another public interest before corporate interests YouTube presentation. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm looking at rights. Yes, it seems to be the big controversial issue in 2021. Rights. People claim it's their right not to be vaccinated. People claim it's their right, believe it or not, to own other people. People claim it's their right to destroy the environment if they can make a buck out of it. People claim it's their right to do what they like to whoever they want to whenever they like. So let's define what rights is. The fundamental right across the globe is the ability of anybody who can live, any human who can live independently of their mother's womb, has the right to life. That is the fundamental right. Fundamental. If your right to life is removed, you cannot exercise any other rights you believe that you may have. Rights like freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of movement. You cannot access those rights if the right to life is removed. Black and white, no argument. I mean, there may be arguments regarding when life begins. Does it begin at the moment of conception, or does it begin when a fetus is capable of independent life outside its mother's womb? Well, for the sake of this YouTube, we will look at that second issue. Independence. So, if I decide to get a gun and walk around and shoot whoever I like, well, obviously I won't last very long, one. And two, anybody I may have killed will have lost any rights they were able to exercise before that. I know this is an extreme example, but that's the way it goes. So do we have the right to endanger other people's lives, or the right to kill them because of our own so-called rights? Well, obviously, if you follow that line of argument, it's quite clear that you don't, because if the fundamental right is the right to live, well, then all the other rights stem from that. And if you remove somebody's ability to survive or endanger their lives, you initially restrict their rights and eventually remove all rights when they lose their battle to survive. So that's why the current anti-vaccination debate regarding individual rights is way off the beam. I don't have the right to drive in an erratic manner in a drug state or a drunken state and kill other people. I need a license, I can be tested, and there are consequences. The same with vaccination. Nobody is saying that vaccination is foolproof. Obviously there are side effects to vaccination in a minority of cases. Obviously, anybody who decides not to be vaccinated has made the decision that excludes the rights of the people around them. Because do we have the right to go about our daily lives when there is an option which we can access that can decrease the danger we pose to other people? So that's the first thing I'd like to look at regarding rights. The second thing is right to and right from. Now, libertarian position, this is the Liberal Democrats, is quite simple. It's the right of the individual to act in any way they like, totally unfettered. And that's why we see the Morrison-led Liberal National Party, slip of the tongue there, very little difference, but there is a difference. That's why the Morrison-led Liberal National Party is very keen to pursue a rights agenda. In reality, they don't believe in rights. They don't believe in rights for their political opponents. They don't believe in rights for trade unionists. A member of the CFMEU who refuses to answer questions can be jailed. People can be fined up to $10,000 a day for not withdrawing their labour during a non-endorsed industrial dispute, and the list goes on and on. So they believe rights for their political supporters. They obviously are quite happy to use this country's legislation in order to remove rights of their political opponents. So the libertarian position is a very simple position. It's the right to exploit, the right not to have a minimum wage, the right not to have any regulations in place which protect the individual. Could even extend to the right to own slaves. We had a civil war in America about that right, the right to own another human being, the right to exploit other people. This is the libertarian position. It's unfettered power for the individual to exercise that power any way they like. Then we have a different philosophical basis, the philosophical basis which I support. It's freedom from, not freedom to, not freedom to walk around and infect our families and friends, members of our community, members of this sovereign nation state. Not the freedom to exploit labour, not the freedom to pass legislation which restricts other people's rights. But it's a freedom from. The right to have a freedom from hunger. If we go back to the original definition of a right, that it's linked to the ability to exist independently of your mother's womb, then the right to food and freedom from hunger is a fundamental right. The right to shelter. If you don't have adequate shelter, you can find yourself in difficult circumstances, especially in colder climates. So the right to shelter where it's needed. In a capitalist society which is based on a wage system and a social security net with increasing holes in that net, the right to an income. The right to an income which provides shelter and food. Then we have the right to security. Do we want people to be able to wander around freely, armed, and do what they like? Or is the right to security fundamentally linked to the right to life? Because if there is no security, then life can be extinguished at any moment, through somebody else's action. So there is a lot of confused thinking and debate about rights in this country. And the most confused thinking about rights is that we somehow think that we have rights in the Australian Constitution. The Australian Constitution protects us from the arbitrary exercise of state power. The Australian Constitution is the only constitution in the Western world which does not provide its citizens and residents rights. There is no right to withdraw your labour. There is no right to a decent income. There is no right to access to shelter. There is no right to security. These are all rights that people have fought for. There's no right to universal health care, a pharmaceutical benefit scheme. Those rights are there now, but they were not in the Constitution. They're there now because of people's struggles to ensure that they have access to rights. Now, obviously, the right to freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech should be quantified constitutionally, but they're not. They don't exist. The only right you have under the Australian Constitution is the right to freedom of religion. No right to a income, no right to shelter, no right to food, no right to move. No, and that's why the various state governments have been able to introduce various degrees of legislation in order to limit the health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, a pandemic which is not over yet. And that's the dilemma. Who exercises rights? What constitutional protections do we have? We have no constitutional protections as far as our rights are concerned. So the struggle for rights is a universal struggle. But are you involved in the struggle for you to do anything you like, irrespective of the social, community, environmental aspects? Or are you involved in the struggle to ensure that other people can have a secure life so they can actually access those fundamental rights? And does a health emergency give the authorities the power to restrict rights which don't actually exist in our constitutional arrangements? Of course it does. Now, those of you involved in this struggle, the anti-vaccination struggle, need to understand 20 years ago we had a huge struggle in this country, a struggle which was only entered into by a significant minority of people. A struggle which centres around rights which are based on the freedom from, not freedom to. And obviously, we need rights. Unfortunately, as I said before, 20 years ago there was a struggle which 99.9% of the Australian population didn't take any notice of. That's a struggle much, much, much more far-reaching and important than your right to walk around potentially infecting and endangering other people's lives because for whatever reason you think vaccination is not necessary. And we can go into that another time. But 20 years ago, the federal government and various state governments passed legislation which removed fundamental rights. They allow the Attorney General, now the Home Affairs Minister, the ability to ban any organisation any time they wish because they believe they may pose a threat. May pose a threat to the country's interests. And that could be a commercial threat. They can do that unilaterally because there is no protection in the Australian Constitution. Legislation was passed which allows the authorities, the federal authorities, the power to kidnap people off the streets, hold them without telling anybody for up to 10 days, 2 weeks, because they may inadvertently have information which may assist them with their investigations. If you don't believe me, look at the legislation. And if you refuse to answer questions, you can be jailed for up to 7 years. Then there is the legislation which is specifically designed to destroy this construction, forestry, mining, maritime and energy unions. And that is the legislation which gives a member of this union less rights than the importer of $1 billion of methamphetamine who has the right to remain silent. But they don't have any right to remain silent. They refuse to answer questions from the Kangaroo Court, which is set up by the Workplace Commission. They can be jailed for up to 7 years. Now, all this is in legislation. It's all very well for the government to say we haven't imposed this legislation, but it is in legislation. And then finally, I'd like to talk about this so-called right to freedom of speech. There is no right to freedom of speech in the Australian Constitution, none whatsoever. The High Court 20 years ago, perplexed with the problem of how to conduct a fair election if there is no freedom of speech, determined there was an implied right in the Australian Constitution to freedom of speech only during the period between when an election is called and when an election is held, that 4 to 6 week period, only then. There's no right to freedom of movement, as we've seen. There's no right to freedom of association, as we've seen with the new legislation. So most of the rights we enjoy now are rights which don't pose any threat to the authorities, especially rights which we want in place to ensure that everybody can freely associate, can form organisations, can have freedom of movement, can go about their lives secure in the knowledge that people can't endanger them because of their refusal to be vaccinated for whatever reason they may have, whether it's religious or whatever, for whatever reason. This is the issue. We have major issues regarding rights in this country, and unless there is constitutional reform, and constitutional reform is almost impossible in this country, because the only way you can put a question to the people, regarding constitutional reform is by the political party for majority in both houses of parliament putting that question to the people. And when they vote on that question, if a majority of the people in a majority of the states support that proposal, then that is incorporated in the Australian Constitution. Could you imagine the rights that which we could incorporate in the Constitution if the power to change the Constitution was not left specifically to the government? That if we had citizens-initiated referendums, obviously there'd be constant debate, politicisation of society, but we'd have a greater chance of constitutional change. So think about it. When you think about rights, think about the right to life, independent, dependent on your ability to live outside your mother's womb. That right to life, and how that, to negate that right, negates all other rights. And those of you who've chosen not to vaccinate for whatever reason, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, we need to remember that most of the health gains we accept today, to a significant degree since the beginning of the 20th century, have been due to vaccination. We are victims of our own success. We have forgotten polio, diphtheria, whooping cough, smallpox, tetanus, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, measles, mumps, shingles, and the list goes on and on. In many cases, the victim is you. If you decide not to vaccinate, that's fine. That's your choice. That's your right. But when your right, or your perceived right not to vaccinate, endangers other people's lives, whether it's polio, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's diphtheria, whether it's whooping cough, we need to reassess the position we've taken. If we've taken a position based on a moral view, an ideological view, fine. A religious view, fine. But don't say that this is a debate about rights. It is not a debate about rights, and it will never be a debate about rights.